A 2013 United Nations Relief and Works Agency report found that the Gaza Strip would be uninhabitable by 2020. Thanks to the 51-day war, however, this terrifying forecast may have been realized prematurely. The Israeli military had not only torn through the civilian population of Gaza like a buzzsaw during the 51-day war, killing some 2,200 people, more than 70% were confirmed as civilians, and wounding well over 10,000. It had pulverized Gaza's infrastructure. Over 400 businesses and shops had been damaged in targeted Israeli strikes. At least 120 were completely obliterated. 24 medical facilities were damaged, including the Wafa Hospital in Shujaia, Gaza's only geriatric rehabilitation facility, whose top 3 floors were razed by tank shelling. A full 1/3 of Gaza's mosques were bombed, from the Al-Amin Muhammad Mosque, a stately structure built in the center of Gaza City with donations from a Malaysian Muslim charity, to the Al-Omari Mosque, a historical treasure that had stood in the same spot in Jabalia since 647 AD, until it was brought to the ground by Israeli missiles on August 2nd. Gaza's lone power station was decimated by Israeli airstrikes on July 29th, leaving most of Gaza without electricity for over 18 hours a day, and sometimes longer. Perhaps the most disturbing figure was the more than 18,000 civilian homes the Israeli military leveled during its assault on Gaza, leaving at least 100,000 homeless or forced to cram into already overcrowded homes of relatives. This next photo is a photo in central Gaza City of one of the more than 160 mosques bombed by Israel during the 51-day war. The violence was not limited to human life. When I visited the Baisan Zoo in Beit Hanun after the war, I found battered cages full of exotic animals shredded by Israeli shrapnel and decomposed monkey carcasses splayed out on a tow path. The small chimpanzees had apparently been blown out of their cages. The rest of the animals seemed to have been driven crazy by weeks of bombings. In a small cage at the rear of the zoo, I discovered a group of dust-ridden foxes running in a seemingly endless circle. It was almost as hypnotic to watch them as it was depressing. In October, the surviving animals were shipped to Jordan, bringing Gaza's only zoo to an end. In the wake of all this destruction, the representatives of the international community returned to Cairo on October 12th. It was expected that they would pledge the necessary funds to repair more than $7 billion in damage that Israel had exacted on the Gaza Strip through its Operation Protective Edge, just as they had done after Operation Cast Lead in 2009 and Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012. Yet, as soon as they arrived, the diplomats were assured from Jerusalem by Israeli Minister of Transportation Yisrael Katz that their efforts at planning the reconstruction were utterly futile. Quote, "The Gazans must decide what they want to be, Singapore or Darfur," Katz remarked, inadvertently comparing the Israeli army to the Sudanese Janjaweed, accused by the U.S. State Department of committing genocide in Darfur. He continued, they can pick between economic recovery and war and destruction. If they choose terror, the world should not waste its money. If one missile will be fired, everything will go down the drain." End quote. The message was not lost on the diplomats. As one Western diplomat told Agence France Presse in a condition of anonymity, quote, "We have seen infrastructure projects that we have contributed to which have been destroyed." The diplomat complained that the sustained Israeli assault on Gaza's infrastructure had prompted, quote, "considerable donor fatigue." Johan Schar, the head of development cooperation of the Swedish consulate in occupied Palestine, conceded during the conference that the inevitability of another Israeli assault on Gaza had rendered the whole rebuilding exercise futile. Quote, "No one can expect us to go back to our taxpayers for a third time to ask for contributions to reconstruction and then simply go back to where we were before it all began," he complained. Quote, "This is out of the question," end quote. Only about half of the $5 billion pledged at Cairo would actually be budgeted towards Gaza reconstruction. The rest, according to Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Rami Hamdallah, would help keep his unelected government afloat in the West Bank, where 30% of the government's budget is spent on the security forces that are paid to police fellow Palestinians on behalf of Israel's occupation. Under the guise of restoring the basic functions of Gaza, the diplomats in Cairo found a backdoor channel to sustain the police state that rules the West Bank's ever-shrinking cantons. Quote, "Without a political breakthrough, I think we'll possibly end up giving, but it will be repackaging the assistance that we already give. A European diplomat told the news service IRIN, quote, "In reality, none of it will be new money. This isn't a terrible amount of political commitment or hope," end quote. Throughout the conference in Cairo, the diplomats discussed the destruction of Gaza as though it was the result of a natural disaster, as though the missiles that reduced the strip's border areas to rubble were meteors that descended from the outer space. Indeed, Israeli violence against Gaza's civilian population was scarcely mentioned at all, nor were any diplomatic measures against it proposed. And with Hamas barred from participation in the conference by Egypt and the US, which refused to negotiate directly with the group, the elected government of Gaza was unable to raise the issue. When Kerry appeared at the lectern, he pledged a piddling $212 million to Gaza, nearly $700 million less than the US gave after 2008 and 2009 Israeli assault known as Operation Cast Lead. He then proceeded to effusively compliment Sisi's efforts. But, quote, "But President Sisi's efforts, I think it's fair to say, have really helped reaffirm the pivotal role that Egypt has played in the region for so long," said Kerry, lending the despot the legitimacy he was desperately seeking. The military coup and subsequent massacres of peaceful protesters that Sisi oversaw were now forgotten, as were the 40,000 jailed political prisoners languishing in Egyptian jails. Hours after the event, Kerry met privately with Sisi to promise a shipment of 10 Apache attack helicopters that would later be used to reinforce the Egyptian army's assault on the city of Rafah. There, Sisi planned to order the demolition of 1,200 civilian homes and the forced relocation of their inhabitants in order to tighten the siege of Gaza. Having already praised the Egyptian military junta for, quote, "restoring democracy," Kerry praised Israel as a generous nation taking, quote, "positive steps" to help sustain Gaza's economy and get the beleaguered territory back on its feet. He trumpeted, quote, "new measures that should allow increased trade in agricultural goods between Gaza and the West Bank and more permits for Palestinian business leaders to enter Israel," end quote, omitting the fact that Israel had banned rebuilding materials to Gaza, indefinitely delaying 60 truckloads from entering in October. Quote, "We hope to see many more positive steps announced and implemented in the coming weeks and months," Kerry declared. Finally, Kerry dusted off an obscure and little understood economic plan called the Initiative for the Palestinian Economy, claiming it was a recipe for reducing Palestinian unemployment to 8%, the same rate as in the US. Unemployment in Gaza after the war had topped 50%. He credited McKinsey & Company, the US-backed corporate management consulting firm that helped Enron exploit California's energy crisis, with producing the initiative's analysis of the Palestinian economy. As a side note, if you're listening, The presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg used to work for McKinsey and Company. Continuing, quote, "We're talking about real investment that produces real jobs and opportunities for thousands of Palestinians," proclaimed Kerry, quote, "and that is what is going to make the difference over the long term," end quote. This next section is called the Sweatshop Initiative. When he rolled out the initiative for the Palestinian economy at the 2013 World Economic Forum in Jordan, Kerry hailed it as, quote, "a new model of development that is bigger and bolder than anything proposed since the Oslo Accords," end quote, promising a $4 billion injection of investment into the Palestinian economy. Implementation of the plan was placed into the hands of Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister and a business-inclined Quartet representative whose corporate network had raked in close to $100 million, advising a vast web of corporations, banks, and dictators from Kazakhstan's Nur-Sultan Nazarbayev to Egypt's Sisi, while tendering a $2 million paycheck to consult for J.P. Morgan. Blair took credit for persuading Israeli administrators to open radio frequencies to allow the Palestinian telecompany Wataniya to provide service in the West Bank. The deal reaped a major windfall profit for Blair's employer, J.P. Morgan, which happened to have provided the $2 billion loan that brought Wataniya into existence through the Qatari telecom giant QTEL, one of J.P. Morgan's top clients. Though, through his role as one of the world's top peace processors, Blair's expanded the crony capitalist network that had earned his network of businesses over $90 million since leaving office. To lend the economic initiative a prominent Palestinian promoter, Kerry recruited Munib al-Masri, the Palestinian tycoon who lived high above the poverty-stricken Balata refugee camp in an Italian arrival-style mansion. He had also enlisted the financial know-how of Tim Collins, a major Democratic Party donor and venture capitalist whose Ripplewood Holdings leveraged buyout firm had liquidated food company Hostess, sending 18,500 unionized workers into the ranks of the unemployed. Early in 2014, Collins had purchased a $30 million stake in one of Egypt's top property developers. Quote, "We are very interested in being a part of the recovery of the Egyptian economy," Collins said at the time. Little was known about the plan at the time. Kerry unveiled it at the World Economic Forum. My email and telephone queries to Rudy Winterstein, Blair's political and policy advisor at the Quartet offices in Jerusalem, went unanswered. Despite his optimism, Kerry stonewalled reporters seeking details about the initiative. Nevertheless, I managed to secure some details of the initiative for the Palestinian economic plan through a Palestinian businessman who furnished me with a 14-page paper that he said was produced on behalf of the Quartet by McKinsey and Company. The paper was a classic document of neoliberal thinking that analyzed the occupied Palestinian territories as though it was a normal developing nation whose economic performance could be optimized with just a little technical know-how, some innovative marketing strategies, and a whole lot of international corporate involvement. Israel had provided the shock, and McKinsey had arrived with the doctrine. The consultants concluded that in the paper that the walled-in Gaza ghetto, quote, underperforms on key tourism metrics, end quote, but the analysts couldn't seem to explain the reason, alluding only to, quote, regional instability and, quote, low awareness of existing tourism destination sites, end quote. Ignoring the Israeli siege, the factor that made literally everything they proposed a total fantasy, the firm suggested, quote, a range of new hotel offerings underpinned by aggressive marketing. If only Gaza could find a winning brand, according to McKinsey, boutique spas would suddenly blossom along its coastline, providing stunning vistas of Israel's naval blockade. To bring Gaza's beleaguered economy back to life, the consultants called for the proliferation of what were effectively sweatshops that would churn out zippers and buttons for, quote, high-end designers in Israeli clothing markets, requiring relatively small, customized orders not handled well by bulk order manufacturers. So much for Singapore on the Mediterranean. Under international guidance, Gaza would become an occupied Bangladesh, producing accoutrements for trendy Tel Aviv fashionistas. Nearly every construction and agricultural project envisioned in the summary analysis had been rendered impossible by Israeli siege and its accompanying military assaults. Not a single dollar had been pledged to northern Gaza emergency sewage treatment project, which was highlighted in the document as one of the quartet's major achievements. And with tens of thousands of homeless crammed into UN schools, the affordable housing units described as an aspiration were just that. Not at one point in the quartet's paper on the initiative for the Palestinian economy was the Israeli occupation or siege of Gaza mentioned, even as he conceded that the Cairo donor conference that aid to Gaza was a, quote, band-aid fix. Kerry offered no political remedies beyond the framework plan for two states that the Israeli government has resoundingly rejected earlier in 2014. As the diplomats in Cairo left Egypt wringing their hands, the Israeli officials issued further threats. Quote, if one protective edge was not enough, you will get 2 and 3 until Hamas terror ends. End quote. Transportation Minister Katz warned, quote, I prefer 1,000 Palestinian mothers crying than letting one Jewish mother cry. End quote. The conflict management approach is the next title of this section. By the time the punishing winter storms were lashing Gaza in early 2015, the charade in Cairo was all but forgotten, and nothing had changed on the ground. But this was no thanks to the United Nations, whose blueprint for reconstruction was described by disillusioned UN officials as, quote, the next stage of Israel's blockade on Gaza. The official concluded, quote, it started with a very crude blanket blockade where pencils and coriander were not allowed in, but now it's becoming much more sophisticated, like the occupation of the West Bank. And now international actors are being embedded and made complicit in the siege, end quote. The official revealed that the UN plan would mandate all materials entering Gaza be vetted by the Israeli military authorities that administered the siege of Gaza. Any family who wished to have their homes rebuilt would have to submit their private information to the Palestinian Authority, which would then supply it to the Israeli military for approval. Every piece of material down to bags of cement would be carefully tracked by the UN, and by extension, the Israeli military was coordinating with. And each family that received rebuilding material would be subject to careful monitoring. Quote, the tight, almost dystopian new controls envisioned in the UN plan for Gaza reconstruction underline Israel's approach to the Strip as being first and foremost a gigantic prison. Only it is being upgraded from a third world prison camp to an American cutting-edge supermax facility. The Israeli analyst Damir Raidir concluded in Middle East Eye. Ron Ben Yeshai, a military correspondent for the Israeli daily Yayadoth Aronoth, was privy to the details of the UN plan, named its authors as the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process Robert Seri, Egyptian intelligence chief Mohammed Farid al-Tahami, Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Rami Hamdallah, and Yoav Mordecai, the Israeli Major General in charge of coordinating the occupation of Palestinian territory. Yeshai described the plan as a blueprint of the, quote, conflict management approach. By January 2015, little of the $5 billion pledged by international donors to Cairo had reached Gaza, and almost nothing had been rebuilt. The UN plan was a non-starter, rejected by Hamas and Gaza's private sector as a re-entrenchment of the siege. While Chris Gunes, the spokesperson for UNRWA, the agency in charge of caring for Gaza's refugee population, warned that Gaza was, quote, submerged in despair, end quote. Sari, the UN special coordinator, blamed Palestinians for refusing to accede to the rebuilding plan he helped create for them. Quote, we need a government that is able to take responsibility, he complained. In February, UNRWA funds for Gaza reconstruction had dried up altogether, forcing the agency to suspend its cash assistance program for those who had lost their homes to Israeli airstrikes during the war. Rebuilding was frozen even before it began in earnest, and there was no sign that it would ever begin. 42,000 government employees in Gaza had gone 6 months without receiving their salary. As Israel refused a Turkish offer to provide an offshore electricity station for Gaza, the Strip remained without electricity for 18 hours a day. The Rafah border crossing was kept shuttered by the Egyptian regime, prompting a crowd of thousands to rush at its gates when it finally opened for 3 days. This next photo is of Wadi Abu Kasi at 3 months old. This child froze to death 3 months later, and the photo was taken by Dan Cohen. So you'll see that. Okay. Continuing. In December, Dan Cohen met the Abu Kasi family in the rubble of their home in Shujaiya. They had been left homeless by the war and were left to shelter themselves against one of the harshest winters in Gaza's history with little more than nylon sheets, scrap metal, and blankets. Dan found the family's youngest child, Wadi, captivated by the bright light he affixed to his camera. Born during the war, Wadi had never seen light produced by electricity. He had only ever known the illumination produced by the nightly fires the family lit to keep warm. On January 15th, about a month after Cohen's visit, 5-month-old Wadi froze to death, making him the 5th child to die of exposure in the punishing winter. A sense of abandonment and despair had consumed Gaza, igniting the flames of rage and spreading radicalization like wildfire. Almost as soon as curtains closed on the 51-day war, the stage for the next war was set. That was chapter 17. I believe chapter 18 is the last chapter, so we're going to finish that today and we'll be done with this book. We'll be back in just a moment.